Thank you very much for still being here. You've had a lot of talks on culture and branding and diplomacy and all these things, so quite a hard act to follow. Also, you know, you're probably thinking, oh my goodness, it's an academic talking, and academics make very easy things sound very complicated. What you could say in 30 minutes, they take 3 months to say. So I'm going to try not to be like that. And also, I'm going to have to give you some food for thought because our stomachs are rumbling at the minute. So, what I want to do is I want to share some things with you, maybe quite ambitious in showing you lots of slides, not too many slides, but I want to share some things and hopefully you can get a picture, and then afterwards, you know, I'm going to share these slides with you. You can put them on your hard drive, you can go and use them at other conferences if you want, make them better. But I think that it takes a bit of time to get our heads around some of the things that we're discussing, and it's after when you reflect on the tube home or whatever it is that you're doing some gardening tomorrow, and to think, okay, well maybe I'll do something different or a bit better tomorrow. So my part in this process is to basically show you some things and maybe to get you thinking. Now, a lot of what I'm talking about is based upon an article, quite a few articles. So if you suffer from insomnia, then I can send you lots of articles that you can read and you can download and things like that. But essentially, I wanted to pair up leadership and branding together and to tell you why I'm wanting to do that. And this has come as part of a journey where I've been talking to people, you know, probably collectively 400 years experience, 185 brands, and basically, you know, it's quite common for me to ask the same question lots of times over a period of time, which is what Socrates was famous for with the Socratic Lancaster. So if you can imagine that, you know, if I'm interviewing somebody as part of my surveys, I could ask them a question today, 6 months' time, I'll ask them the same question, and I keep asking the same question until they say, look, I've had enough, could you just leave me alone? Because then I really know that that's what they think. But along the way, what I'm also doing is I'm sharing what other people are saying, and so what I'm looking for is a consensus of opinion. Now, in speaking to people working in advertising and branding and academics to see if there's an academic practitioner divide and recent graduates and people with lots of experience, I've kind of come to some of these findings that I'm going to share with you now. Now, essentially, my approach to looking at things, and I would call it cultural phenomena, is to look for objects and associations. So, for example, if I show you this picture here of this Japanese lady, where is Mr. Wong? Is he still here? No, he's not. Okay, so when I showed this slide in the United Arab Emirates, for example, they thought this was the latest Emirati fashion. This was the latest abaya catwalk chic, right? This is a lady with a headscarf and an abaya and some really fancy shoes. In fact, and they thought that she was obviously a Muslim. In fact, she's wearing traditional Japanese clothes. She doesn't profess to be a Muslim. She is, and she has a very fantastic summer umbrella, which is not to shield her from the rain. So I wanted to get you to think about the fact that often when I'm looking for objects and associations, it's looking at a variety of meanings and testing to see how other people see those meanings, if there are differences of opinion or whatever. Now, if we think about culture, and we're talking about cultural diplomacy quite a lot, I've done the hard work for you. If you want to know what the definition is, well, there are over 200 definitions last time I looked. So constantly people are coming up with definitions to try and make sense of culture. What I didn't want to do was add to that list of definitions, because if there are over 200, then I think that's probably enough, right? But here are 3 of my favourites. And one of my favourite is the one back from 1948, which is the man-made part of the environment. So if you think about objects and associations and nature and all of the things around us, it's when they start to have some sort of fingerprints or coloration which we impart on them, then that's when they start to become cultural. Or different customs, different people, all of these sorts of things. So now you know what culture is. Branding. Well, I'm not going to give you a classical marketing definition of a brand, a name, a label, a shape, and all this kind of stuff. I think it's far easier to say that they are meaning shapers, language creators, and game changers. I think you understand that better. It's the sort of thing that stitches all of those meanings together in a very short burst. So now you can do a Google, right? Or if you're even younger, I remember, you know, somebody asking, you know, two guys asking each other questions. One said, well, where can I find out this? And he said, Google's your friend, my brother. So now we realize that, you know, from that statement, Google is your friend, my brother, right? That rather than I'm terribly sorry, I don't know where I could find out that information, or perhaps you'd like to look. People are seeing Google as their friend, or you're doing a Google. I mean, the challenge is if you can get a brand and it can become a verb to Google or to Wiki or Hoover or things like this. This is a really good brand, right? But essentially, the brand is the thing that when you say that name, for want of a better term, then it paints a picture, and it's associated with lots of different things and concepts. Well, another way of looking at it is this. Brands are really about making money, right? It's about monetization. And also, brands are about a defensible position. Now, often, I get students that talk about branding and they say, but, we're brands if you think about it. We have a name, And I wouldn't go as far as to say that people are always brands or all people are brands, but there has to be something there which is defensible, if that's legally defensible, or, you could say conceptually defensible, that people recognize you for that thing. But ultimately, I think the hallmark of a brand is that there is some form of monetization. So I remember I was in the United States in May and somebody said to me, your hair is part of your brand. And I said, well, if my hair helps me to make more money, then yes. But if my hair, and I think from experience, my hair hasn't actually helped me get any pay rises at all. It's got more comments about getting a haircut than getting a pay rise. So I'm not sure if it is actually a brand attribute. But one of the things I want you to think about from the picture is, and this is of a Japanese sword, a katana. Now, if you're in Japan, this is a piece of cultural heritage. It's not a weapon. But if it was made in China, it's a weapon. And that's a really important point to take home. So that if you were, for example, going to go to Japan and you were going to buy a real Japanese sword, you would need the letter of approval. You need the certificate of authenticity, where it was made, who it was made by, and it would carry a premium. But if you were going to buy a sword made in China, then it's not a katana. Even if it looks the same, even if it has the same steel, it's a weapon or it's a piece of cutlery. So think about that for 1 minute. Think about the fact that culture and branding are imparting different meanings onto various objects. Now, ultimately though, if we're thinking about brands, another way of looking at it is it's about power, right? In the Japanese theme, I have some pictures of sumo wrestlers there, quite powerful chaps. And I've just pasted a definition from a dictionary on all of the different connotations of power, but I want you to reflect upon those for some minutes and think about this, what power means. I know we've spoken about hard power and soft power. If you're in the natural sciences, it means something completely different. Is it about potential? But ultimately, when I've looked at literature, over the past, I'd say about 60 years, definitely branding is about power, but the way that power is expressed has changed. If you think about a good example is looking at the old adverts. Old adverts are generally quite direct. They could say, you are a housewife. If you want to make your husband happy, then you should use this washing up liquid. And people go, oh, okay. Whereas now you can't even show a car in a commercial. You can't tell people how many miles it does to the gallon because that's just too obvious. You have to see somebody looking at a car going by. Give them a little hint of the upholstery. But we don't explicitly express lots of things because it's lost its resonance. So power changes, but remains something of importance. Also, I want you to think about how appearances matter, but how they are perceived differently. If we look at this tribe here, this is the blueprint as to how to, if you want to be a guy, this is how you look great. This means being really attractive. And so I think for all of the guys in the room here, we're not really up to scratch, right? If we wanted to look really good looking, really impress people, then it would be to have the makeup, to have the plumes, to be good at dancing and all of these things. And that means being a really attractive guy. So essentially what I'm saying is that if we think about things such as branding and culture, and also the concept of a nation, I'm going to suggest to you that they are units. They're things that we need, it's a manageable chunk. So if we think about nation branding, it's really a unit of analysis as opposed to, a packet of chewing gum, which is also, it's a product, it is a unit. So the nation we are treating as a unit of analysis. Culture plays a part, a brand plays a part, and if they are units of analysis, I'm going to argue that they are containers and formulae. The reason that I would stop short of necessarily having a definitive definition for culture or for even nation is that I think that the best description I can give, and I actually half thought about, I thought it'd be a bit unfair, but I was going to bring boxes of sweets to show you that. So I'll have to describe. Imagine a box of sweets. Box number one, I was going to give you a box of, I don't know, Quality Street, and you're going to open them and it was going to be full of cotton wool. Bits of, because I've got a young baby at the minute, so we've got lots of cotton wool lying around, right? And you're going to think, goodness me, there's this container and there are no chocolates in there. Well, sometimes containers don't contain what you think. But then the reward was going to be an even bigger box of, I don't know, Cadbury Celebration or something, where you've got lots of mini Mars bars and Milky Ways. But the thing that I want you to think about is, whilst standard definitions of nation mean that you have geographical boundaries, if you think about the concept of a nation, it does not necessarily have to have boundaries. If you think of it as a container, you can have as big a container as you want. You can put whatever you want into it. And that's very much the same as culture. So good, strong national brands tend to have very big containers with lots of nice things. But the important thing is, in having a container, is that people know where the container is, that you open the container, that you share what's in the container, that you understand what's there. And so there's no point in having a national brand or, you know, or the verbal part or, you know, the adverb, the branding element, unless you're actually actively doing it. So it's about actively doing those things and thinking of it in terms of a container. Because if you go back to some literature, I think even about 150 years ago, even the concept of a nation, according to some behavioral psychologists, is a very Western one. The idea that you have this container and you have a nation. If you think about larger parts of the Commonwealth, it wasn't about the nation or the national identity, it was about the tribe. Tribal structures or clans, or, I mean, I'm Scottish, so I understand kind of clans and tribalism. But this was the unit of analysis. It was whether there were shared values, and it went beyond geographical locations, which is also why it's quite difficult in certain parts of the world to actually map out when a country was a country and wasn't a country, because boundaries have shifted. If you think about Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran and all of these places, they've had some very quite interesting boundaries. So if we've got containers, we've got brands, and we've got culture, what's the next part of the equation? Well, of course, it has to be leadership. Now, a bit of audience participation so you don't fall asleep. Hands up. You've got two choices here. We've got a zebra there. Is a zebra a white animal with black stripes, or a white animal, a white animal with black stripes, or a black animal with white stripes? Who says it's a white animal with black stripes? Okay. Who says it's a black animal with white stripes? Okay. You said it was a white animal with black stripes, right? You have a colonized mind. No, I'm joking. Now, you want to know what the answer is, right? It depends where you look. Now, if you look in certain literature, from an anthropological perspective, they will say it's very much subject to your cultural frame of reference. Apparently, people from Africa tend to see this as a black animal with white stripes, whereas people from Europe tend to see it as a white animal with black stripes. But it's still the same animal, right? Now, some zoologists would now more recently argue that, of course, it's a black animal with white stripes because our hair tends to go white rather than our hair going black. So the predominant colour is black and there is an absence of pigmentation. But I'm not really worried about the right or wrong answer. I think it's interesting to think and just to remind ourselves that not everything is black and white or black and white in the ways we see it. So if we think about this concept of how your lens can colour how you perceive things, and then we look at this in terms of leadership, and there are lots of different styles of leadership. The idea that you're going to motivate people in a transformational way, that they're going to want to be swept along in this wave of inspiration, be empowered to make these decisions, is something which has become more and more in fashion, because the concept of leadership has lost some of its luster. This idea that you have to be a good leader. Well, we don't know what a good leader means, do we? Is that autocratic? Is it democratic? Is it laissez-faire? Is it servant leadership? So many different terms, but transformational is the latest one that's in fashion. This idea that you're getting other people to move with you. So if we've got brands and culture and transformational leadership, how do we get these things to work together? And here's a picture from Raphael, the School of Athens, just to remind you that philosophers have been debating these things for a long time. And more recently, you could argue that with such complexity or with so much to lose, how can we control these things? And this comes back to this power thing. How can we engineer? Because engineering is kind of an aspect of power, isn't it? Now, I don't have all of the answers, but I can put some concepts to you. So one of the things that I would say is, and one of the things that I found from my research was, actually in asking people questions on these aspects, I actually asked them, this was my crib sheet. I wanted to know their profession, how many years they'd worked, and what positions. So if you were a CEO but you'd worked as a paperboy, then I wanted to know that you'd worked as a paperboy as well. It was the full career history, the countries that you'd been to for work, for pleasure, the languages that you speak, your socio-cultural network. All of these things are really important. So, for example, rather than the usual kind of HR forms that we might fill out saying that, I am a British national, I am mixed heritage, my mother is Caribbean and my father is Scottish, that really doesn't tell me enough. What you might like to know is that I am obsessed with Japanese culture, or I do martial arts, or I like Bruce Lee, or, one of my best friends is from another country. These things start to permeate your cultural frame of reference. And I believe that it expands you rather than it knocks something out. One of the things that you often hear from, especially very culturally centric communities, is this idea of you losing your heritage or losing your culture. You go back home after years away, and they say, "Oh, you've changed." Depending on you've become a sellout or a coconut or a banana. I won't define these terms, but I think you can guess what's being said there, right? But some of these terms might resonate with you. And you might even start to believe that what they're saying is true, if there is this monolithic definition as to what it is to be of this national stock or this cultural identity. So I think that this bottom end is really important, and that led me to believe that it's not about experience, but experiences. Learning about nation branding or cultural identity heritage is about sharing experiences and understanding what experiences you have and how that impacts on what it is that you do. So, culture. Similarly, rather than give you a definition, I'll give you a picture. Cherry blossom, right? I was looking at cherry blossom and still on the Japanese theme, obsessed with the fact that I spend all year waiting for it to blossom. It coincides with one of my daughter's birthdays, and then it disappears in a few days, right? Very much the samurai culture. But the beauty of it reminded me of the overlapping petals in the sunshine. And from what I was inspired towards thinking is the idea that when I look at literature, if it's business literature, they talk about organizational culture, or corporate culture, or departmental culture. Then you look at anthropology and they talk about a national culture. But everyone is talking about culture, but I think that it overlaps, right? In some countries, it's very cultural, right? You have a national culture, you have an organizational culture, a departmental culture, you have an in-culture, a subculture. All of these things work together, and in some countries, it's not very cultural at all, in the sense that there aren't overlapping or contested spaces. So the next thing that I'd like to say is that culture then is really about mapping this, and it's not just a picture, it's a Venn diagram to get people to reflect upon where culture overlaps or where things cross over, and if they cross over, does that cancel them out or does that make them more intense? So, if you want to know how to do good nation branding, then watch a movie like Inception. That always goes down well with my students, right? Their homework is to go and watch the movie Inception. But the idea of creating a dream within a dream, the architecture of actually trying to create these images and to be in control of them is really important. Nation branding, the art of nation branding and also the science of nation branding is connecting things together in such a way that the architecture allows you to paint these wonderful dreams that we love roaming through. What that also means is that if you put them together, and this is the concept of Gestalt, what I'm suggesting to you is that lots of individual objects, when put together, derive greater meaning. So some of the artwork that I've got here, you can see that the lady on the far side is made up of lots of different flowers. We've got the rather macabre picture of the lady looking in the mirror here, and it looks like a skull. The old gentleman, which is made up of someone riding on a horse and someone lying by the side, and of course the flower and the butterfly making the silhouette of a woman. Now, this is the trust element of creating a good national brand. The engineering doesn't mean that you have to walk people through every single step and stage, but the idea that you should trust in that if you put enough information, enough concepts, enough things together, people will start to piece them together and they will see something. Not everybody will see that thing, but a variety of things will come to fruition. And if you can do it really well, then the picture could be quite emotive. So within this Gestalt, also there is the mask of cool. Now, not so long ago, I thought to myself, and you can imagine with lots of students, that they spend a lot of time looking at things like social media or youth culture and fashion and luxury branding and all these sorts of things. And a word that often comes into conversation is cool. If you'd asked me about 20 years ago, as an undergraduate, what cool meant, I would have said, if I have to tell you what cool is, then you're obviously not cool and you never will be cool. But then 20 years later, I found a definition of what cool is, or an explanation. When I looked at, there was one interesting paper, and they spoke about the African slave trade and the concept of cool coming from slavery. If you think about, for 1 minute, slavery, which is obviously a terrible thing, but think about, and the thing that was lost upon me was the reality of that situation and for how long it went on. And one of the things, especially, traveling to the Muslim world, and it's a shame that Mr. Wong wasn't here, because it kind of resonated with me when I was thinking about some of the concepts and how people understand or misunderstand various things. But one of the things that really hit me was that when I looked at, for example, the fact that quite a lot of the slaves, or about a third of them, were Muslim, coming from West Africa, and what that if we put the religion to one side, but if you think about the rituals and the attire of people at that time was turbans and robes and long flowing clothes and gold-hilted swords and all of these things. And then we then put this against the picture of people that are naked and chained. And you can understand now in a modern context how sensitive certain Muslim countries are about how many clothes should be worn. You can imagine how awful that situation would have been. And also the thing that was lost upon me was the fact that actually, to me, common sense would dictate that if you're going to enslave someone, you'd pick the strongest, fastest, most hardworking people. Well, actually, what tended to be the case was that you picked people that were the most intelligent or the most influential in order to destabilize economies. So behind that backdrop, you have this thing called cool, which basically means grace under pressure. If you are one of these people that's enslaved, the last thing that you want to do is admit defeat. Hence, you create a mask, an emotional and a physical mask through your expressions which says, I am not beaten and I'm not broken. Now we fast forward to today and we think about James Dean and we think about all of these icons and Jay-Z and all of these people that are cool, and cool is obviously commoditized, but the roots are exactly the same. It's grace under pressure. If you think about young people now, what does it mean to act cool? It means, well, I'm not bothered, don't really care, I didn't try very hard, it just came easily to me. And whether that's that you've got ripped jeans on or distressed biker's jackets, or you don't text somebody straight away, all of these things are in essence tapping into the same concept of cool. So if we're going to do good nation branding, it should be cool, right? It should celebrate heritage. It should celebrate all of the things that have the good and the bad that have been brought together into fruition, but allow us to have grace under pressure. So what that basically means, if I start to piece everything together, is that, and I call this, for simplicity, I call this model a changes model, because all of these terms spell out changes. But I'm really talking about culture, and I'm talking about the hybridization of culture. And people talk about melting pots and hybridization and all of these things, but ultimately it only resonates if it's authentic. It's all very well talking about hybridization and how that's a very good thing and melting pots, but if it doesn't have the stamp of authenticity, it doesn't work. That also means that nation branding plays a part, and these two bottom things, the game theory and the nation branding is really important, because the reality is we can't escape our heritage or our national identities. And so if I'm teaching branding or I'm giving workshops, one of the things that I often joke about is, if you could imagine you had a product which was cheese. Now, if you're from France or Holland or Switzerland or places like this, then you're laughing, right? Because we all know that they make great cheese. Or, as I found out recently, Serbia's got amazing cream cheese. But then what if you're from Nigeria? And then people would always giggle in the class. There's always someone that giggles, the idea of Nigerian cheese or Afghani cheese or Iraqi cheese. But if I said Argentinian cheese, you think, well, they do good beef, so they might have good cheese. So what do you do in those situations? It seems that we can't escape the fact that we have tags, which are our national identities, our nation brands. That is where the game theory is. Now, if you're Nigerian, does that mean that you come up with fromage l'amour, the cheese of love, or you put made in Nigeria really small, or you circumnavigate some of those things? But I think it's important that we have to face truth head on. We can't just ignore the fact that cultural heritage linked to a national identity has a bearing on what we do. But that's not to say then that we rank everything and then England is at the top or America is at the top because everybody speaks English now, right? It's the language of business. I know some people will frown. I'm very sorry about this, but can you imagine? Lots of people are speaking English. Even I went to some conferences in the Muslim world. They're talking about Islamic economics and finance in English. It's kind of ironic, really, but this is the reality that we're living in today. But if we're speaking about English, what English are we talking about? Japanese English, Jafaican, Indian English. All of them mean something slightly different, right? East London English, South London English, Geordie, they're all speaking English, right? And I think that the turning point for me was to start to realize that it's not about even evangelizing or trying to colonize people with a language and saying that it's about speaking proper English and they speak American, they don't speak proper English, or they speak Australian, they don't speak proper English. But it's about accepting the fact that there are lots of different Englishes and then trying to understand that if that is the way that it goes, how do we work around those things and work together, and how does the language evolve? And that's pretty much what advertisers do anyway, right? We break all the rules. We don't have uppercase letters in certain campaigns. We get rid of punctuation, or you come up with slogans like to boldly go where no one's gone before from Star Trek, which is grammatically incorrect. It's to go boldly, but it doesn't sound as good, so why do we do it like that? So essentially, I'm talking about this idea of communication, and that culminates in surrogacy. Now, surrogacy is a term which is about adoption, but I'm going to extend that and basically say that it's not just about adopting somebody's culture, but it's about also putting yourself up for adoption. The idea of surrogacy in botany is about grafting two plants together so they become one. So I want you to think that it's about adopting, but also wanting to be adopted. Putting yourself up for adoption. That's really important. That is where authenticity is. If you're not stepping in the shoes of the other person meaningfully, rather than I respect your values and your culture, then it's not really going to resonate. And if you can get onto that platform of culture, then the branding will slot into place and the leadership has to follow, right? But the transformational leadership is where everybody is taking a lead on the things that are important. So that basically means, and it's kind of my last couple of slides, from A to G, essentially what I'm saying is articulating a concept, but articulation means joining things together, not just speaking in nice flowery English or whatever language you want to use, but like an articulated lorry or an insect, it's joining things together. And those things culminate in a branded identity. It has to be credible, you have to be dedicated in doing so. And the other important thing I'd like to say is that in these last three areas, emotions overtake reason. You don't create the function before the emotion. The function captures the emotion. And finally, giving. You can't survive now in a social media world unless you give in the hope that you receive. We don't like to be sold to hard sell. We don't like pizza leaflets through our letterbox. We don't like being asked to pay for things very much, right? But we like people that give us things and don't expect something in return. And then we might patronize, we might reward you. So giving in the hope that you receive, which is very much a cultural approach of doing things. If that's going to happen, then I think that we have to move away from the standard concepts of marketing and business and hard economics to more anthropological economics. And that really means taking a lead on things like branding and public relations, where you are creating things collaboratively. You're congregating, you're amalgamating, but also, if you can do those things, you can still control. So, I think that I've probably spoken slightly over, but open for business and open for questions. Thank you very much. Oh, that is the perfect question for when you've not prepared a lecture. It's an MBA question. Basically, you just put people in a room and then you put that question there and then they talk for an hour and a half and no one ever finds out what the answer is. Personally, I think that it's a mixture, but I don't think the leaders are born, because if they are born, then what's the point? What's the point in me trying harder or going to university or getting educated? I think that it's a very serious undertaking, and the concept that someone is born a leader, I think trivializes some really good leaders who've worked really hard. I remember reading a book where apparently if you want to be world class at something, you need to do 10,000 hours of practice. And that could be if you want to be a great basketballer or a great public speaker or a scientist or whatever, but 10,000 hours. And I think that comparably, if you want to be a really good leader, you have to kind of put in the serious miles and hours. So it isn't just about a God-given right or natural attributes. Granted, some people might have natural, they might have a very powerful voice, or they might be very tall or very strong. But I think that there are so many examples in history of people that have bucked the trend. But I think there is something about a leader where, see, the thing is, a manager has to be perfect. Managers have to have no flaws in their character. They just have to basically implement a strategy. But a leader, you can make a few mistakes, you can have a few character flaws, but you need to be able to connect with people, and people have to want to, put their hand in your hand and walk together. And I don't think that comes easily. That comes through lots of hard work. I don't know if that answers your question. I think charisma is really important, but I'm not a subscriber to this one-size-fits-all approach to charisma. I think that similarly, if we take a side issue, if you look at what makes somebody funny, if you think about comedy, so a lot of the time I also spend watching comedy and looking at stand-up comedians and thinking, how did you make that thing that's very serious very funny? And everyone has their own style or their own delivery. And I think that then to be a leader and to have charisma is to go through this journey and this process where it's unique to you, and that is your unique selling point, and that cements your leadership attributes as well. And so everybody, I think, can be charismatic. Yeah, of course. If you go all the way back, the thing is, I think we probably become boring as we get older. If you think about really young children, show me a toddler that's not charismatic. 2 to 3 years old, they're all charismatic, they're all pretty cool, right? In the same way as I remember another question where I thought to myself, why is it that all babies drink milk, but then when you reach adulthood, not everybody drinks milk? And I thought that was another simple question, like the zebra one, but that one kept me busy for a few hours, right? It depends on a lot of factors. There are psychological, there are biological, But, if you're from Scandinavian countries, you're more likely to be drinking milk as an adult than if you're from China for some physiological reasons. But in the same token then, if we think about charisma, I genuinely believe that everybody could occupy a leadership position and could be charismatic. You just have to find the right calling for that person. And if you can do that, then that's the key to nation branding, because essentially the unit of a nation is so big, you need evangelizers or leaders or thought leaders or people to take a lead on these very important issues. And that is the gestalt that, can you imagine if you go into a country and you cannot escape the fact that everybody is so happy or so friendly or so helpful or knows, do you know this and do you know that? And I'm always impressed by when you go to countries like that and it seems that they've been given a script, but everyone plays their part. And you go away thinking, oh my goodness, what an amazing country. But that means then it's not just about having one figurehead or one sovereign ruler that then is the leader, and that makes it a very strong nation brand. It's actually about, from the bottom up, people going around doing these amazing things. See, one of the things that I reflect on, because I started off in industry and advertising, and I came to academia late, was academics are very good at saying, well, it's really simple, this is how it is. So that there can be evidence that suggests that leaders can be made, can be trained, can be learned. Just like when you look in branding textbooks or advertising textbooks or management textbooks, lots of social science textbooks that say this is the blueprint, this is how you make a good brand. Now the bits that I didn't fill in with some of my research were, I actually asked people, how do you make a terrible brand? How do you make a mediocre brand? Because I started to think to myself that actually, if it's so simple, why do people always, fall short or make mistakes? Or, in some of my research in trying to understand things like national identity or branding, I look at things like music, punk music, hip hop music, sports. You look at the World Cup was one I've been following. And you think, so how did Spain do so badly? I'm from Manchester. Why is Manchester United so terrible? Away from Alex Ferguson. Was he that good a leader? Was it really about him? Were we 13 points ahead because it was his leadership? Why is Van Gaal suffering? And why is it that people, why is it that somebody wants to go out with that guy who is a real dog? He doesn't treat her right, but she still likes him better than the guy that treats her, a lot better. And it's those interesting nuances that I think are sometimes veneered over by this idea of big systems and big concepts that you engineer people together, that you prove through, you know, quantifiable methods that say this is how it is, because a lot of good brands break the rules. The rule book was there and they ignored it, and then they succeed. I think there is something which is very dynamic, and it's very much bound in the individual, and if it was that simple, then I think we wouldn't be here having a conference like this. So I suppose my summary remark is that I think even with big systems, it's not about everybody having to see the bigger vision. Actually, I think that is almost verging on the hard power, right? I think that, you know, probably one of the good things about the United Kingdom has been the fact that it is quite open source. You know, I mean, in my classroom, for example, if people want to leave, they can leave. If they want to have their hair blue or dreadlocks or, you know, face covering or whatever, I really couldn't care. You know, if they want to heckle me, it makes me a better public speaker, you know, because I then have to step up my game. And so I think that as online and social media is demonstrating, an open source approach to branding, which is less about holding on to power, but distributing power through diffusion of innovation, through collaborative sharing, and actually being, I suppose, a level of maturity, which is that hope thing that I mentioned, which is giving in the hope that you receive. So it's actually becoming a bit more of a spiritual thing, and I think that brands that do that have the power to transcend. So I think too much control is a bad thing in some ways.